Welcome, friends, to El Samira Executive Certificate in Religious Fundraising Conversation Series. This series is designed to provide course participants with a series of presentations about philanthropy, giving, and fundraising within the Latinx and Hispanic communities. My name is Dr. Carlos Perkins, and I'm honored to serve as the Associate Director of Engagement at Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. I'm also the lead instructor for the El Samira Executive Certificate in Religious Fundraising. I, along with Dr. Jorge Rodriguez, are looking forward to being with you later on in 2026. The El Samira Executive Certificate in Religious Fundraising course is an educational program offered in partnership with the Hispanic Scholars Program, AF, and Lake Institute on Faith and Giving as a part of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at IU Indianapolis. The three-day course is especially designed to equip Latinx and Hispanic theological leaders with skills in fundraising and development. Before we gather, we wanted to provide you with an opportunity to hear from individuals with vast knowledge and deep experience with philanthropy, giving, and fundraising within our communities. Our first conversation in this series will feature Dr. Philip Wingeier-Rayo. Dr. Wingeier-Rayo is Executive Director of Education at the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry of the United Methodist Church. Previously, he served as a professor of world Christianity, missiology, and Methodist studies at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., my previous home. He's also the author of 5 books, including his latest book published in 2025 by Abington Press, John Wesley and the Origins of Methodist Missions. Dr. Wingeier-Rayo will be joined by Elizabeth Liahani Kofi. Elizabeth is Managing Director of Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. She has more than a decade of leadership experience in faith-based education, philanthropy, and nonprofit strategy. Shaped by her Hawaiian heritage and rooted in San Antonio, Texas, Elizabeth is known for designing spaces that connect theological imagination with social change. We will hear first from Phil. Following Phil's presentation, Elizabeth will share a response. And finally, we will round out this recording with a bit of question and answers. And although these conversations are pre-recorded, we hope you will take note of what questions and reflections you may have about fundraising and liberation theology, and bring them with you. So when we gather together in person, we may be able to continue this conversation. With that, I want to invite Phil to begin his presentation, which will be immediately followed by a response by Elizabeth. Phil, welcome into the space.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perkins. It's an honor to be here and to share. Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to the conversation with my colleague, Dr. Coffey. And I have prepared some brief remarks, and I look forward to your questions and comments in the Q&A time. I'm going to begin my presentation, and I'm going to be citing some authors. In order to help with that, I have a visual aid of a PowerPoint, and so please allow me to share my screen. And so I have simply entitled this Latin American Liberation Theology and Faith-Based Philanthropy, a presentation prepared by yours truly for the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving in collaboration and partnership with El Semillero of the Hispanic Scholars Program. So without further ado, allow me to jump in and share. And I'm going to be citing one of the authors, who is Edgar Villanueva. I have his book here entitled Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance. So this presentation will explore the relationship between Latin American liberation theology and philanthropy, particularly fundraising for faith-based organizations engaging in theologians, fundraisers, and authors who are passionate about improving the quality of life of underserved communities. This talk will place liberation theology in conversation with the philosophies and ideas around fundraising developed by different authors. Here you have on your screen Edgar Villanueva. I'll also use as a dialogue partner Henry Nouwen, Robert Lupton, and Gustavo Gutierrez, and then a Latin American journalist by the name of Eduardo Galeano. So you have before you on the screen author Edgar Villanueva, and in this book, Decolonizing Wealth, he uses a metaphor for money as water. Villanueva, who is a Lumbee Native American from North Carolina, he acknowledges the wounds of racism, colonization, and dehumanization that have negatively impacted his community, but also generally people of color and women. Villanueva begins with the question in his book, what if money could heal us? He sees money as value neutral. Like water, money can cause great harm, or it can be a precious, life-giving resource. Villanueva writes that money should be a tool of love to facilitate relationships, to help us thrive rather than to hurt and divide us. End quote. Like Villanueva, now I'm going to bring on the screen another author whose name is Eduardo Galeano. There you see the dates. He passed away in 2015. He wrote a book called The Open Veins of Latin America that was first published in 1971 in Spanish and then in English in 1973. He makes the case that poverty in Latin America is intrinsically linked to the wealth in the global north. The metaphor of open veins refers to the extraction of resources out of Latin America to places like Europe and North America. Another author is Gustavo Gutierrez, who is known as the father of liberation theology. He wrote the now classic book, The Liberation of Theology, History, Politics, and Salvation, that was originally published in Spanish and then translated into English by Orbis Books in 1973. Reflecting on the perspective of the poor in Latin America, the late Peruvian priest and theologian Gustavo Gutierrez critiqued the theory of developmentalism or gradual change. In this book, The Liberation of Theology, Gutierrez argues for reforms of unjust economic systems that favor the wealthy, and instead he calls for the conversion of both persons and structures. Any attempt at gradual change for Gutierrez could increase the dependency of the poor upon the rich. Gutierrez also makes many important contributions to theology. And here on my screen, I have named three of these. One is Gutierrez places theology in dialogue with the social sciences. He challenged the traditional biblical interpretation method to first examine one context and interpret scripture in light of the current reality. So this was a change in the method of theology. Oftentimes doctrine is considered to be something that has come down to us from heaven. And Gutierrez reverses that methodology and says, well, let's look around us at our context socially, economically, culturally, and then read scripture from the perspective of our own current context. Another change that Gutierrez makes is he picks up on the language from the Second Vatican Council, which was held between 1962 and 1965, that makes a preferential option for the poor. Particularly in the case of Latin America, there was a meeting in Medellin, Colombia, 1968, where the Latin American Catholic bishops make this preferential option for the poor. And of course, Gutierrez is a priest from Peru. He is writing from this context as a priest in a poor parish. Lastly, Gutierrez argued that salvation is both spiritual and historical, meaning that salvation is not merely a spiritual state in the afterlife, but a current healing or wholeness where humans live with dignity in this life. And so, in other words, rather than the spiritual plane being somewhere in heaven and the earthly plane being the material world, he brings these two together, and he believes that salvation will be both spiritual and historical in this time, and that humans should be treated with that dignity. Gutierrez was a contemporary of Henry Nouwen, a Canadian priest, and there you see his dates up on the screen. He was the author of the classic book, The Wounded Healer. And Nouwen reframes fundraising from a burdensome task to a spiritual form of ministry in his book, A Spirituality of Fundraising. There you see the cover on the screen. Rather than seeing fundraising as a burden or a divergence from ministry and something that happens in the secular realm, Nouwen views fundraising as another form of ministry that invites people to participate in God's mission. For Nouwen, fundraising is a way of calling people to conversion, a new way of relating to their resources, to others, and to God. Nouwen writes in his book, The Spirituality of Fundraising, fundraising is proclaiming what we believe in such a way that we offer other people an opportunity to participate with us in our vision and mission. So Nouwen invites the readers and people in faith-based ministry to not be shy in fundraising, but rather an invitation for a person who has resources to participate in what God is doing. Nouwen's philosophy of theology or philanthropy could be critiqued by Latin American liberation theology as being naive or wanting to convert the person without converting the structures that have created inequality. In Nouwen's book, a donor could give and alleviate a feeling of guilt without addressing the unjust economic systems that generated their wealth. This could lead to charity or the betterment model, critiqued by Lupton, that creates greater dependency for the underserved communities. Gutierrez advocates for empowerment of the marginalized to find solutions and address their own needs. In his book, Decolonizing Wealth, Villanueva, who we have already discussed, grew up in the Lumbee Indian community, which was a marginalized community in North Carolina. But he landed a job with a philanthropic wing of R.J. Reynolds, a tobacco company. He uses the metaphor of money as medicine that can heal the wounds of racism, colonization, and dehumanization. Villanueva sees money as neutral that can be used to exploit, but it also can be used to help communities to heal. Another author is Robert Lupton, who wrote the book Toxic Charity. And in his book, he warns what many consider as charity, especially one-directional aid, such as handouts, food, clothing, giveaways, short-term mission trips, free services, can end up harming the very people it intends to help. Lupton refers to this charity as betterment. Betterment is often well-intentioned, but can create dependency between the person or the communities in need and the donor. Instead of alleviating poverty or long-term need, it often erodes dignity, undermines initiative, and stifles the self-reliance of recipients. Lupton invites the reader to move from a model of embedment to a model of development, which he argues strengthens capacity. Lupton writes in his book, development does for others. Development maintains the long view and looks to enable others to do for themselves. So now I'm going to start to conclude my remarks with the end goal. The end goal of philanthropy is to not create dependency, rather for the community to identify their needs, be the protagonist of their own destiny, and seek donations that will partner to accomplish goals established by the communities. Now, I'd like to end with this quote, who Villanueva cites in his book by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who wrote in his book, The Book of Forgiving, when we assault another's humanity, we insult our own humanity. Every person wants to be acknowledged and affirmed for who and what they are. A human being of infinite worth, someone with a place in the world. We can't violate another's dignity without violating our own. Thank you very much. I look forward to Elizabeth's comments.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you. Thank you. We'll now invite Elizabeth to provide her response.
Dr. Wingeier-Rayo, thank you. Phil, thank you so much for the care and depth with which you have placed Latin American liberation theology, I think, in direct conversation with faith-based philanthropy and fundraising. Your weaving of these texts offers us some wonderful mental, emotional, and spiritual pathways for the questions I believe many of us are holding inside of the institutions, inside of our institutions and inside of our faith communities each day. I certainly am. I think what struck me most deeply is your insistence, right, that fundraising cannot be separated from salvation or this spiritual healing or spiritual existence. That framing matters so much. It reminds me that how we relate to money is not peripheral to discipleship, but it's central to it. I want to offer my response through some convictions connected to what you shared that have been formed in my own work at the intersection of faith, philanthropy, and community. They've been shaped through practice, they've been shaped through relationships, but quite honestly, many of them have been shaped through pretty uncomfortable, but amazing conversations with community members, calling me forward into new and more whole perspectives myself. So, the first conviction I wanted to share is that, and it aligns with some of what was talked about already today, is that fundraising is not morally neutral. As you presented, Gutierrez teaches us that theology must begin with the interpretation of our social reality. Galliano teaches us that wealth does not emerge without histories of extraction. And Lupton teaches us that even well-intended aid can still wound and cause harm. And I think taken together, along with um, what it has looked like for me in walking alongside of communities, I'm led to the reality that fundraising is never simply a technical function. Always, it's always a moral practice. Every fundraising system teaches something. It teaches what kind of suffering counts, what kind of outcomes matter, who is visible, and who remains unseen. I think liberation theology refuses to let us hide behind the language of necessity or best practice that we've inherited from broken systems. It insists that economic practices reveal our deepest theological commitments. Fundraising is not something we do after ministry, then it's or even because of ministry. I genuinely believe it is itself. Fundraising itself is a site of moral formation. And yet, once we admit that fundraising is not morally neutral, we are immediately confronted with a harder, more personal question is what kind of power and memory does money itself hold? And that leads me to my second conviction. And it's that I really believe money always carries story and money always carries power. Thank you for including Edgar Villanueva's metaphor of money as water. That metaphor resonates deeply with me and my own cultural formation as a Hawaiian. Um, and honestly, at the same time, it's a hard connection. It's complex and pretty difficult for me sometimes. In the Hawaiian language, the word wai, W-A-I, the word wai means water, and then the word wai means wealth or abundance. So at its root, the Hawaiian language teaches that wealth is not first about accumulation, but about access to a life-giving flow like water. Water was and is the most precious resource that, and proximity and access to water means well-being, it means health, it means survival. But water is also sacred. And in my cultural as well as in my faith formation, that's true, that it signals proximity to the divine. Um, so my understanding of water is completely bound up with the idea of life, the reality of life, the idea of holiness. It's bound up in relationship with the things I can see and touch and the things I can't. Because of that, I find that the metaphor of money as water both resonates with me, but is also deeply complicated. And I'm not a historian. I feel like I need to own that before I say what I'm about to say. But my basic understanding is that money emerged in human society to solve particular human and economic problems, like to make trade easier, to measure value for the things and that we were trading, to store wealth across time, to manage debt or to know how to name it, to articulate it, and to at a systems level to organize states and power. And so water's fundamental purpose is to sustain life, but I really believe money's fundamental purpose is human made and tied to systems of exchange and control. And that difference matters to me at a spiritual level. And yet, like you named, Villanueva also speaks of money as medicine that can heal the wounds of colonization and dehumanization. From my Hawaiian perspective, I would add that just as with water, the question is never simply right whether it flows, but who controls the flow, who is denied access, what land does the water pass through on its way. So again, yes, like water, money can irrigate life. Um, and like water, it can also be hoarded, diverted, polluted, bottled and sold, and even weaponized. So to boil it down, no pun intended. Uh, in uh, in fundraising, we may like to imagine money as neutral currency, but in practice, we can't forget that money always arrives carrying an inherited story of extracted labor, of racialized advantage, of institutional fear, and sometimes genuine love. Liberation theology does not allow us to pretend those histories are erased when a donation becomes a gift. It asks us to tend not only to the flow of resources, but to the relationships and the power structures that govern that flow in the first place. Um, so the third conviction is that liberation is not only about then distribution, but it's about dignity and voice. That Lupton warns us that, like you already mentioned too, that betterment charity can erode dignity even when it meets material needs. Gutierrez warns us that gradual reforms can deepen dependency even when they appear compassionate. And together they teach us that liberation cannot be measured only by where money goes, that it also must be measured by who gets to speak, who gets to make decisions, who gets to lead. In fundraising practice, this becomes a question of, I think it becomes a question of narrative authority. Who defines the need? Who names the solution? A conviction that then relates to institutions is my fourth conviction is I think institutions always choose between extraction and accompaniment. Henry Nouwen gives us this beautiful vision of fundraising as spiritual ministry, as this invitation, like you said, into God's mission. And yet, Gutierrez would rightly ask whether the spiritual conversion is accompanied by the conversion of unjust structures as well, right? That tension sits at the heart of your that tension sat at the heart of your presentation, and I thank you for that because I think it's so critical that institutions are not neutral vessels either, that they shape the rules of participation. They define what's fundable. They construct the narratives that circulate in public. And so institutions always face a choice, I think, and that choice is between what extraction says. And extraction says, your story matters insofar as it advances our institutional survival. And then that choice then against what accompaniment says, which says your life matters regardless of its usefulness to our budget. Um, Fundraising reveals perhaps more clearly than any other practice then which economy an institution is actually cultivating. Okay, last and final one. I have many other convictions, but I will only list five. I believe generosity can produce inequity or rewire it. Um, Villanueva insists that money can heal. Lupton insists that charity can harm. Uh, Tutu insists that dignity is a non-negotiable. And when we, I think, place all of them together, I think we are forced to ask not simply whether generosity is occurring, but what kind of world our generosity is quietly normalizing. There's a form of generosity that stabilizes unjust systems by soothing the conscience of those who benefit from them. And then there's the form of generosity that participates in structural repair by redistributing not only money, but redistributing power and agency and authorship. So fundraising always forms someone. And the question is, whom is it forming? But also, and into what kind of moral imagination? So, what your presentation surfaces so clearly is the institutional paradox many of us live in today, every day, even. We depend on fundraising systems that were shaped inside economic logics that liberation theology rightly critiques. And tied to that, budgets are real, payroll is real, turning on lights, very real. Donor and stakeholder expectations are real, and yet the gospel continues to declare an alternative economy in our midst. So the danger, I think, is not that this tension exists. It just does. I think this in our world it will. But the danger is when it no longer unsettles us, when our survival instincts begin to outrun our theological courage. So I want to end with a few wonderings that I'm having after today or because of today. Um, what if fundraising were treated as a primary site of discipleship rather than merely a professional function? What if donors were formed not only in generosity, but in relinquishment and shared decision making? And what if communities who are most affected by economic harm were not only recipients of funding, but architects of philanthropic imagination itself? I believe liberation theology gives us more than analysis. It gives us permission to hope for an economy that looks more like kinship than control and more like shared watershed than private reservoir. With that, Phil, I am grateful for the way your work helps the church remember that how we raise money is inseparable from who we are becoming. Thank you for inviting us to refuse the comfort of moral neutrality and to remain accountable to the dignity of those whose lives I believe are most affected by our economic practices. So, thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Phil. That was a rich, um, felt like a conversation, but two presentations. I'm going to invite, because I can see Phil really kind of responding in his own head as Elizabeth was presenting. And so, Phil, I'm going to invite you in this question and answer period to kind of share any thoughts that you had while Elizabeth was presenting. But I also want to invite those that are watching, like as you've experience and listen to both Phil and Elizabeth's presentation, what questions do you have as we are preparing to gather together, right? What questions, what convictions do you have? What wrestling do you have? Phil, let me invite you in to any immediate reaction from Elizabeth's presentation. And then I have a question or two because I want to leave some room for the participants in the ECRF to wrestle together when we are in person.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Elizabeth, for your response and your presentation and for sharing those 5 convictions. I was particularly moved by you continuing the metaphor of money as a water by Villanueva and sharing from your own cultural background from Hawaii. That's an amazing connection that why is water, but when you put Y and Y together, that means abundance. And you continued that towards the end of your presentation. You talked about ways that we can imagine water as not being in a reservoir that somebody can control and restrict, but in an ecosystem where all people have equal access to water. And that invites us to a more egalitarian vision of people not having this dualistic understanding of the donor and the recipient, but equal say. And so you're inviting both the donor to, in a sense, give up power or allow the people who are requesting money, who are perhaps writing a grant proposal, to define the terms and say, well, we're defining this is our need, and we're also envisioning this is what success will look like. And so it's more of a conversation where the donor, kind of like in the sense of Henry Nouwen, is invited to a conversion. But the critique of Nouwen is that it's only a spiritual conversion. And so what I see you proposing in your conclusion is that it has to go deeper than just the spiritual conversion, but also opening up space, opening up room at the table for the community to define, well, this is what our need is, and this is what success will look like. And that really hits home with Bishop Desmond Tutu's remark about human dignity. And when one person's human dignity is harmed or is limited, then everyone's sense of human dignity is also harmed. And so that conversion must be deeper than just a spiritual conversion, but also allowing equal access and equal participation in the conversation. So I think that's beautiful to continue that metaphor of moving beyond just a reservoir to open access.
So use it. Thank you, Phil. Thank you. Using the lens of liberation theology, I want to push the conversation a little bit about philanthropy versus the systems that create the need for charity. What would you say to participants that might have a strong critique of the strategies because it seems like it's ignoring the systems that have been created that give a need for charity?
Well, I'll take first bite of the apple on that question. I mean, it's a great question because in Gustavo Gutierrez's writing, he really critiques developmentalism as kind of gradual amelioration that doesn't really address the unjust system that has created the disparities in the first place. And so he is calling for a more radical reform, particularly of economic systems. And so I think if a community is requesting a grant from a philanthropist or is requesting assistance, I think that a community must decide, well, what are their limits? Uh, would you accept money from a company that is contrary to your values? Maybe they are making money in a way that is can you consider to be immoral, or perhaps the product that they produce actually harms your community and they're extracting resources from the very community that you're trying to assist. So I think someone who's requesting a grant must seek out organizations that they're comfortable with. They're comfortable with the values, the principles of that organization. And if it's out of bounds, then don't apply because that would that would sacrifice your own values. And I think that there are companies, there are donors that do have values that you can agree with and that you feel comfortable working with them. So I think that's the first thing, establish what are your boundaries. The second thing is in a sense, an attitude. Do you see that this donor or this company is willing to listen to your needs? Is this a relationship of dependence, or do you see that the attitude is someone that they're willing to listen, hear your concerns, and really work with the community? So I think that would be two initial responses to your question.
I'll share too. I bet y'all watching this didn't know y'all were going to get a Hawaiian language lesson today. But I think there's another Hawaiian word that I think helps me because your question, Carlos, is so good and so fraught, right? There's so much inside of it, so much emotion, p- um, uh, tied into how people discern and move. Um, think about how to find stakeholders or partners and donors. So, but there's this Hawaiian word mana and MANA mana, and it's your spirit. It's like your grit. And Hawaiians believe that when a gift is given, a piece of that donor, that person's mana is embedded in that. And so, what I completely respect is the 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 careful discernment that I have seen organizations who understand their identity, understand the identity of the people that they care for, understand the identity of their community, recognize that is this good mana or is this bad mana? Because this is not just about financial viability. This is not just about financial sustainability. This is about who we say we are in the world. And so I want to honor and respect that if your tendency is to critique this, then I think that is so important. Like I said, I think the biggest danger is if we when we stop. Like I think the biggest danger is when we stop. But the fact that the tension exists is not going to go away. Like, and I think that, and that's what's challenging. And so, this idea of competing goods, these of you have a value system, and when do you allow a gift or a relationship with a donor um, to measure up against a set of values that align in some places and don't in others. And so I resonate with what Phil is saying is like I think some of it is just truly understanding as a community who you are and not apologizing for that. And not shying away from that as you fill out grant applications, and also recognizing how or when you go to donors for asks, but how do you posture that the audacity to be exactly who you are, the audacity to bring the whole community to forward to a donor that you represent, while holding it out for them to see and understand in a way that they can receive and honor with dignity too. And yes, that is a lot on them to come across that bridge as well for you. And I think what feels unfair sometimes is that the askers, especially in particular communities, have to walk further across the bridge to get there than the other. And I believe that with time comes trust, and that eventually you don't have to walk as far across that bridge any longer. And I believe that comes with time.
Thank you both. Thank you. I want to wrap with this last question and then give you guys an opportunity for any closing remarks. I am so excited and looking forward to our in-person time together with the cohort this year. I want to go back, Elizabeth, to your third conviction because that's really resonated with me around the thought, the idea that liberation is not only about distribution but it's also about dignity,
Mm.
right? What then, one of the things that we have heard over the last 3 years in our cohorts with El Samero is, okay, now what do we do with this, right? So we go through the training for the course executive certificate for 21 hours. Now we feel like we need some preparation. And so we've added a grant writing module to the third day. Using that conviction, what then would you say to philanthropic organizations,
Mm.
right? The conviction around liberation theology that this is not only about distribution, but it's also about dignity. What would you want philanthropic organizations to understand? And both of you guys can respond to that.
Gosh, I mean, there's a whole study and practice of trust-based philanthropy, and
Yeah.
so I invite people to consider that. I feel like when I talk with philanthropic leaders, when I talk with donors, um, I I think what's so challenging is the lack of proximity oftentimes they have to the root of societal problems. But beyond that, the lack of proximity they have to true communities that are navigating those societal problems day in and day out on a regular hour-to-hour basis. And so my invitation to them is to see these communities, that the wisdom is in the communities. The wisdom is in the people who are living in and a day in and day out in these neighborhoods. They are the subject matter experts. And what does it mean to set aside all of our assumptions on what makes somebody an expert? What makes somebody an expert on a problem, on pain, on societal gaps, and who gets a microphone, and then who gets to make decisions on where money goes and distribute that. Like that's where that's my consider what I ask philanthropic leaders to consider um, is actually reconsider who they think an expert is and why, or at least ask themselves some pretty hard questions about that. And I want to say I've seen organizations ask even the same healthy, amazing questions of themselves, and on the flip other side of things, um, land on a spectrum of healthy responses, right? So like there's a just because we're asking good hard questions of ourselves does not mean we land in necessarily a healthy response. But I would say how many of the community members that you're participating with and alongside of do you actually know? Like where your money's going, how many of those people do you actually know? How many homes have you visited? How many soccer games have you sat at of their kids? How many of those restaurants have you been a patron of in their neighborhoods? And just begin spending time. And that is inefficient. But I believe that trust is inefficient on purpose, and it needs to be. And I'm building that takes a long time. That's where I would start.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you. That's a great question. Well, at the end of your previous response, Elizabeth, you furthered the water metaphor about uh, the asking community having to walk further across the bridge. So, Carlos, your question about the dignity of the community makes me remember that the community does have power, the community does have resources. And so, ideally, the donor or the philanthropic organization should come across halfway to meet the community where they are. And this reminds me of a method of community development called asset-based community development, where communities will do a mapping of the resources that already exist in their community. Oftentimes, communities, especially underserved communities, can feel powerless, and that makes the dependency even greater on outside donors. But when communities can look at inside themselves and see, well, we do have resources. We have wisdom, as Elizabeth mentioned. We have know-how. We have people in the community who have institutional memory, and especially religious organizations. Many churches have a facility, they have a building, which is a great resource. There might be parks in the community. There might be boys and girls clubs. There may be businesses, and the businesses, they have stake in the community. They want the community to be safe for their clients to come and patronize their businesses, restaurants, stores. And so these are all resources within the community. And if a community can map those out and realize, hey, we have something we're going to bring to the table. And when we meet with a donor or a foundation, we want them to see that we are doing our part, and we have this wisdom, these resources to share as well. And I think that can make it a more equal conversation.
Thank you. Thank you both. Want to afford you the opportunity for any closing thoughts as we are getting ready to wrap this and invite our audience to our time together later on this year for our executive certificate. Any final thoughts?
I'll just express gratitude for everyone who's chosen to go through this course. And you're choosing it, and we don't know what your day-to-day looks like, but you're bringing an amazing community alongside of you that may not be physically present in this course, but we know you're bringing them into this learning experience, and for that we are grateful. We're excited to learn from you as well, and for hopefully for the community that you're forming together. So only gratitude. Thank you.
I also thank you, and thanks for the conversation. And I went through this cohort on faith-based fundraising, and my takeaway was a line that was towards the end of the in-person gathering, and that was that we have to have a healthy relationship with money in order to be good at fundraising. And so sometimes we think of the needs of the community, we think of the organization, but just personally, do we have a healthy relationship with money? And I think this also relates to what Henry Nouwen said, that we're inviting us to be in a conversion. So this is a faith matter. Do we personally, are we healthy in our relationship with money? And that just allows us to put money in perspective, that money isn't everything. And when we have a healthy relationship with money, we can manage it, and we can see that it can really be used to heal the wounds of our community, as Villanueva said. So I look forward to the responses of those going through this cohort, and hopefully people can continue this conversation.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Elizabeth. You both have given us a lot to think about, and looking forward to our time together. For those that are watching, we will include a list of supplementary resources and sources that both Phil and Elizabeth have referenced. If you'd like to learn more about what they've referenced in their presentation, And of course, when we are gathered together, we will keep this conversation going about liberation theology and philanthropy. This has been a rich time of reflection on fundraising and liberation theology. We hope that this time has resonated with your own experience and sparked your own imagination in your own context. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your leadership in your own organization that is cultivating generosity within your own community. As Elizabeth said, we are looking forward to learning from you as well. We'll look forward to seeing you in the course later on this year. Thank you.